Before we start the podcast, we wanted to let you know about WestOS. If you're a teacher or pupil at a school in Scotland, then you now have access to hundreds of quality assured video lessons created by teachers to support your remote learning. You should be able to find WestOS within the app library of Glow, where you can add the tile to your own personal launchpad. Click on the tile and you'll have immediate access to stream lessons in every area of the Scottish curriculum, with video lessons already available for biology at National 5, Higher and Advanced Higher. Now let's get on with the podcast. This podcast is sponsored by Lecky textbooks, revision guides and practice papers, everything you need to learn, review and prepare for your senior phase assessments. Browse the books at www.leckyscotland.co.uk and get 40% off using the discount code LeckyPodcast40. You can now also collect Young Scot reward points by using the codes within the description of each episode to claim discounts and rewards on their website, www.young.scot.
Dad, you realize that you're being played by the Hulk and Mom's being played by Catwoman.
Directed by Todd Haynes, Dark Waters was the 2019 film which told the true story of a corporate defence attorney who took on an environmental lawsuit against a chemical company, exposing a lengthy history of pollution. In this episode of the Higher Biology podcast, we'll be speaking to Robert Bilott, the internationally recognised litigator, advocate and author whom the film is based on, and about this powerful story and the impact of bioaccumulation. So today we're joined by American award-winning environmental lawyer, Rob Bilott. Welcome to the Higher Biology podcast, Rob.
Thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
Now, I believe your father was in the Air Force, so you'd have probably moved about quite a bit when you were young. How many schools did you attend over that time?
Oh, wow. Yeah, we did. We moved quite a bit. I think, at least almost a dozen different schools, if you count up the different elementary schools and high schools. So, yeah, it was a different experience, that's for sure.
Yeah. And did you get to study any biology when you were at any of those schools?
I think not until I was maybe in junior high and high school that we actually get to any biology classes.
And did you enjoy science during school?
I was not the best science student or math student. In fact, that's why I eventually ended up going to college at a small liberal arts college in Florida that didn't have any real kind of science or math requirements. You could design your own course study. So I went there for college, and that's how I ended up in law school as well. I was doing my best to avoid math and science, but life has a funny way of twisting things around on you. And I ended up spending the last 24 years immersed in science and chemistry. And that's kind of what I do on a daily basis now.
So what made you decide to become a lawyer apart from trying to avoid science and biology?
That was a sort of a roundabout decision as well. I had originally thought I was going to be an architect. I loved art and drawing and designing, and then I realized there was a lot of math involved in architecture. So when I went to college, I thought I was going to be a city planner, and actually was signed up to go to graduate school in city planning. And then my dad actually kind of talked me out of that. He had retired from the Air Force, and he actually went to law school while I was in high school and in college. And in fact, he had just graduated and he was starting his legal career. And he said, a law degree might give you a lot of additional opportunities, and you really ought to think about it. So one day I went in and took the law school admissions exam, and I ended up in law school. So I've been practicing law for the last, it'll be 32 years this September.
I was going to ask you, did learning science at school provide any useful skills for becoming a lawyer? But I guess possibly not if you were trying to avoid it at all costs.
Yeah, I ended up having sort of a refresher crash course through some of our experts that we retained in the later years that helped me understand what I was reading and all these different chemical formulas and what difference does it make if a carbon is attached to a fluorine and all of this stuff that I had I think I had glazed over when I was younger and sort of dealing with it in a real world situation. Kind of brought it all back and started to make sense.
So you do go on and graduate and you get offered a job with, I guess, a big corporate legal firm. And I think you joined their environmental team and things were going pretty well. And you were just about to be made partner at Taft. Now, that was the legal firm that you worked for. I think you were probably married with 3 young boys at that point, and obviously having to provide for them. And then all of a sudden, a cattle farmer who knew your gran Alma appeared on the scene from Parkinsburg in West Virginia, a gentleman called Wilbur Tennant. And I guess he changed your life. What happened?
He did. I had started with the law firm Taft, Stettinius and Hollister in Cincinnati, and right out of law school. And as you indicated, I joined their environmental group. I really thought that was one of the courses that really kind of stood out to me in law school. I thought was sort of a real world application of law. So when I saw that the firm had an environmental group, really not knowing what that meant, I went ahead and joined the group back in 1990. And most of what I was doing those first 8 years that I was there at the firm was really kind of learning the whole system of federal and state and local laws and rules and regulations governing hazardous toxic stuff going out into the world. And most of the clients I was dealing with, our firm was representing a lot of big companies. And a lot of the folks I was dealing with were big chemical companies. So I was helping them try to figure out how much of these chemicals can they emit into the air, into the water, how much can you put into a landfill. And I thought I understood that whole world pretty well after doing that about 8 years. But as you indicated, I got a call one day from a gentleman who identified himself as a farmer out in West Virginia. His name was Wilbur Tennant. And he told me that he had cows that were dying on his property. And I was about to hang up the phone because that's not the kind of thing I did. I had no idea why he was calling me. And he mentioned he got my name from my grandmother. And so I paid a little closer attention. And what he explained was he was raising these animals outside Parkersburg, West Virginia. And as we talked, as I mentioned, my dad was in the Air Force, so we had moved around a lot. But my mom had grown up in Parkersburg, and every holiday, family birthday, we would always go back to Parkersburg. So kind of saw that as my hometown. So when I heard this guy was calling me from there, that my grandmother had given him my name, I thought, at least I'll listen to what he has to say and see if I can help him. And what he ended up explaining to me was he had over 100 cows that were getting sick, developing tumors, or teeth were turning black. They were dropping dead. And he was pretty convinced. He could see what was happening. There was white foam coming out of a landfill next to his property, flowing into the creek that his animals were drinking from. And he could see these animals getting sick over the last several years. He'd been videotaping it. And nobody would help him. He had called the state environmental protection agency. He'd called the federal environmental protection agency. He'd called the company that owned the landfill. Nobody was giving him any answers. And he was convinced there was something in that white foam that was making these animals sick if somebody would just pay attention and look into it. So, I listened to this story and said, why don't you go ahead and bring all your information up here? We'll take a look. And he did. He came up with, this is the days of VHS tapes, and he came up with all these videotapes and photographs, and we looked through it, and it seemed obvious. There's white foam, and here's these animals. it wallowing in the foam. And he even had video of himself cutting into these animals after they had died to see what was happening. And you could see in the videotape, you have black teeth, deformed organs, green ooze inside the animals. And, this is the kind of thing I helped companies do. I helped them get permits to run landfills like this. So I thought I could help him. I thought, this would be fairly straightforward. I would get whatever the governmental permits were that allowed this material to be dumped into the land. I'd look at what was regulated in that permit, because typically permits would tell you how much of certain chemicals are allowed to be released from that landfill. And there would be limits. And they would identify all the toxic hazardous materials that you were allowed and how much you were allowed to emit. And I thought it would be pretty easy. We'd pull that permit, and there's probably something that was being emitted above those limits. And we'd get to the bottom of it pretty quickly. So we agreed to take that case on back in, it was late 1998. But what I discovered was it was a lot more complicated than that. There was a chemical in that water that wasn't on those permits. It was incredibly toxic, incredibly persistent, bioaccumulative, carcinogenic, nasty stuff. It was there in massive quantities. It causes white foam, but it was completely unregulated. It was something that wasn't on the permits. In fact, the government agencies didn't even know it existed at the time. And so that is, when we discovered this, it led to a huge process to try to uncover what is this stuff, how bad is it, and most importantly, then to get that information out to the rest of the world. Because what we discovered was that chemical wasn't just in the water these cows were drinking. It was in water likely all over the planet and was getting into the blood of virtually every person on the planet.
If it had been fairly straightforward when you took on that case, it wouldn't have made for a very good film. But in 2019, you were played by Mark Ruffalo in the film Dark Waters, which tells the full story of that case against DuPont, who were the chemical company involved at that point. What did you make of the film itself, and how did it feel to be played by the same actor who played the Hulk in the Avengers?
Yeah, that was a surreal experience. That was something I had never experienced before, and it was a fascinating process. To be able to be involved in the making of a film like that. I had sat down to write a book on the whole story called Exposure. But Mark Ruffalo had reached out when he saw an article in the New York Times Magazine back in 2016 that had talked about this story. And Mark had been very involved in environmental issues and water pollution issues, and was shocked when he saw this story that nobody really had heard about this. That it was in the New York Times Magazine, but not on the cover of the New York Times, on the newspaper. Why were people not talking about this? Particularly when it became clear that this was a chemical that was likely all over the world. So he had reached out, really wanting to try to find a way to bring this story out, to a wider audience. And, at first I was sort of taken aback when you get a call from Mark Ruffalo, but he had, was really passionate about doing this story and doing it the right way. He had teamed up with some incredible people at Participant Media, the studio, with Todd Haynes, the director, and just really put together an incredible team to tell the story and to tell it the right way. And, I had, as you mentioned, I've got 3 boys. And at the time, this movie was being made, they're in their late teens, early 20s. And I still remember the day we found out that Anne Hathaway was going to play my wife, Sarah. And that was one of the few times all 3 of my boys were impressed. They said, "Dad, do you realize that you're being played by the Hulk and Mom's being played by Catwoman?" So yeah, it was fantastic, because a lot of that was filmed here in our law offices in Cincinnati. It was filmed in the real places. I got to consult on the script, got to be there when it was being filmed. We even got a small cameo at one point. My kids are in the background in the movie, so it was a it was a tremendous experience. And it was unfortunate that it was coming out right about the time the pandemic was hitting. So, a lot of the movie theaters got shut down while it was rolling out. But luckily, it's out there now and people are able to see the story.
Within the film, we see you in a room filled with boxes and papers as you begin to, I guess, piece together what's been going on. How long did it take you to work through all that evidence made available to you?
Well, believe it or not, that process is still ongoing. I have been going through millions and millions of documents beginning in 1998. And what you see in the film is pretty accurate. I mean, back when this first began, it's before a lot of these documents and information were started to be stored on computers. Nowadays, everything is stored electronically in emails on computer servers. Well, back then it was paper, boxes and boxes of paper. So it took years pouring through those documents and piecing this story together, to really understand what was going on. And, even since the original cases, we've continued to collect information. There's been continuing litigation as these chemicals have turned up in other places and all over the country, other parts of the world. And we've continued to piece together this story, of how these chemicals were created, what was known about how toxic they were, and what, unfortunately, what was allowed to occur despite that information. That information being covered up from the public, from scientists, from regulators for decades. So it was a long process, but one, at least for me, was critically important to be able to sit down with those documents and actually just read through them, put them in chronological order and start reading through and seeing that story unfold.
And can you give us just a kind of brief overview, I guess, of the timeline that you've been piecing together?
Well, the chemical that you see in the film Dark Waters and that I talk about in the book Exposure, and there's also a documentary, The Devil We Know, where you see the real people from this story in the community. The chemical at issue there is called PFOA, perfluorooctanoic acid. It is a chemical that was invented right after World War II by the 3M company. Didn't exist on the planet prior to that point in time. And it was used in manufacturing certain products like Teflon by DuPont. And that's one of the products that is focused on in the film and in the book. But what we now know is PFOA is just one of an entire family of chemicals that all share a very common characteristic. They're all these man-made chemicals that have carbons attached to fluorine. And then we now call this family of chemicals PFAS, PFAS, per and polyfluoroalkylated substances. We now know there are hundreds, if not thousands of them. Again, all man-made, beginning right after World War II. And these chemicals that have carbon chains that range from 1 to 12. And for example, PFOA, the one we focus on in the film, that has 8 carbons. It's called a C8. A closely related chemical, PFOS, also manufactured by 3M, was used in things like Scotchgard and firefighting foams. But we now also have newer chemicals in this family that might have, say, 4 carbons or 6 carbons, or maybe 9 or 10, but they're all part of the same family of PFAS. And this carbon-fluorine chemical bond in structure is what apparently makes these chemicals so incredibly useful in so many manufacturing products, but also makes them very difficult to break down in the environment. It's a very strong chemical bond. And again, I'm repeating what my experts told me over the years, because I was no chemistry expert, that's for sure. But I understand that this chemical structure makes them incredibly difficult to break apart. So not only are they useful in industry, but once they get out into the environment, they almost, particularly the C8s, never break down under natural conditions. It takes thousands, if not millions of years for those chemicals to start to break apart. That's why you see them referred to now as forever chemicals, because once they get out there in the environment, they stay in the water, they stay in the soil, they stay in living things, and it takes them a long, long time to break down. What we've seen, unfortunately, is we're dealing with a huge group of these chemicals, and they've been used in an incredible array of products. Things that are stain resistant, waterproof, fast food wrappers and packaging, things that keep grease from seeping through, like the fast food wrappers on the burgers, on the French fries, pizza boxes, microwave popcorn bags, waterproof cosmetics, construction materials, computer chips. One of the products that folks are really focusing on all across the world is a type of firefighting foam where these chemicals historically were used, where PFOA and PFOS were used. It's a type of firefighting foam used to combat petroleum-based fires. In other words, when there's a gasoline or an airplane crash, a car wreck, something where there's gasoline involved, this type of foam called aqueous film forming foam, AFFF, has been used at airports, fire stations, military bases all over the world for decades. And unfortunately, these C8 PFAS chemicals were in those foams. And if you look at how do you use that, you spray it out all over the place. So we're now finding that these chemicals have managed to end up contaminating drinking water outside of airports and military bases and fire stations and places where this foam was used, which unfortunately is all over the planet. So you're looking at a large group of chemicals that are in many, many products that have managed to make their way into our environment. And they have this unique ability to also get in us. And when people are exposed, when living things are exposed to these chemicals tend to get into our blood. Unlike a lot of chemicals that our body can eliminate very quickly, we flush out, or maybe they deposit to fat, or they stay in certain places where they don't do harm. These chemicals have this uncanny ability to get into our blood, where they then circulate throughout our system. They stay there because our bodies don't know how to get rid of them. So they persist. And most disturbingly, not only do they stay there, circulating, coating our blood-rich organs over and over every day, they build up. Every little exposure to these chemicals, you get more and more of it in you. So they tend to bioaccumulate. They stay in the blood, they persist, and they grow to larger and larger levels. So that's why there's incredibly increasing concern, because the types of health effects that have been associated with these chemicals are increasing every day.
And within our higher biology course, we do state that bioaccumulation is a build-up of a chemical in an organism, and that biomagnification is an increase in the concentration of a chemical moving between trophic levels within the food chain. What is ultimately then the impact on human health?
Well, it's wide and varied, unfortunately, because again, keep in mind the way these chemicals behave. Our bodies don't know how to process them. They get into our blood, where they're circulating constantly and building up. So they're there a long time. It's almost like the concept of a ticking time bomb. The longer they're there, the more they have the potential to cause harm. And what we've seen over the years, we've had independent scientists. You see this in the film, for example, in Dark Waters, and I talk about it in the book. We set up this process to have independent scientists confirm what the health effects were. Because what we saw within the internal documents of the companies making and using these, companies like 3M and DuPont, were that they had known these things were toxic and hazardous to humans going back decades, but they were disputing that. So we set up independent panels of scientists to confirm what we had been seeing in those documents, but to do it through independent scientists. That took 7 years. We had 70,000 people in the community near Mr. Tennant's property in West Virginia that participated in those studies. And those studies ended up confirming that PFOA, the one chemical we were talking about that was the focus of the film, PFOA alone was linked with 6 different diseases: kidney cancer, testicular cancer, ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, preeclampsia, high cholesterol. That was work that was completed in 2012. Since then, scientists have continued to look at these chemicals, and what they're seeing is even broader effects. For example, we now know that these chemicals can also impair our immune system. And most disturbingly, they have the potential to possibly decrease the effectiveness of vaccines. And think about that. Here are man-made chemicals all over the planet, in our drinking water, in our soil, that are now getting into human blood. These chemicals have been found in about 97% of humans on the planet. All right, so these chemicals are coursing through our blood. They're even passed on to children in the womb. They've passed through the placenta. So the chemicals, children are born with these chemicals, pre-polluted. And these are chemicals that have been linked with these serious diseases, including cancer, and also may impair our immune system and our ability and the effectiveness of vaccines while we're all dealing with a pandemic. So this is a really big potential human health threat, which is why you're now seeing scientists and regulators across the planet that are very concerned about any exposures to these chemicals. And you're seeing safety levels drop to lower and lower and lower, almost to where if you can detect these now, we're concerned about it. Because what we're seeing, not only are the types of health effects expanding, we're finding different and more varied health effects. The levels at which those health effects are occurring are getting lower and lower and lower. The lower exposures are finding all these effects. So you're seeing very widespread concern that we need to do what we can to identify where are these chemicals coming from, where are they in the environment, and how do we minimize human exposures going forward? Because unfortunately, they've been identified with a really wide range of potential human health impacts.
And I guess that could then be one of the reasons why we do seem to see such high rates of cancer and liver disease and kidney disease more and more, I guess, as in society.
Well, I think a lot of scientists are really starting to get concerned about this, because if you think about it, a lot of times when you try to look at a chemical and see whether or not it's causing a particular type of disease, you want to have an exposed group, and then you want to compare the rates of disease in that group to the, quote, background, the normal unexposed people. Well, think about this. With PFAS, you almost don't have any unexposed background group. I mean, you're talking about sort of worldwide health trends and health effects and health impacts. So it's very difficult, to deal with this when you're talking about contamination on a global scale in a scope of which we've really never quite dealt with before. And it's disturbing, particularly when you look at the rates of certain types of cancer and the increases and the parallels between those rates and when these chemicals started making their way out into our society, in the 1950s and 60s, and really skyrocketed during the 70s and 80s.
Would it be fair to say that there's a wee bit of a public misperception that if a chemical is as dangerous as that it would be regulated?
Absolutely. In fact, it took me a long time to really start to really accept and believe what I was seeing in these documents. Again, I had been spending my career assuming that we had this very complex system in place to protect us. We had federal laws, international laws, state laws, local laws, rules, regulations that had been developed over decades to identify hazardous toxic materials in our environment and to set standards and limits and to protect us. And what I saw and what this story reveals is that we've got a major problem with that system. There are major gaps. And primarily because you have to look at the history of how that system developed. At least in the United States, we didn't even have a federal environmental protection agency until 1970. Some of our first laws regulating the safety of chemicals being emitted out into the environment, what kind of testing you had to do, that didn't roll out until the late 1970s. And when you look at these particular chemicals, the PFAS chemicals, They were invented in the 1940s, late 30s, 1940s. They were in mass use decades before those rules and regulations even started to come out. And when those rules and regulations started to come out in the 1970s, at least in the US, they really focused on new chemicals from that point forward. But what about those existing chemicals that were already out there? It was really left to the companies that were making or using those, sort of an honor system. They were supposed to alert the agencies if there was some chemical that needed to be reviewed, or there was some risk to human health, or studies that were indicating there was a need to go look at one of those existing chemicals. And what we saw in this story, particularly when you look at the story of PFOA, that just didn't happen. There was incredible amounts of data that were being generated throughout the 1960s and 70s and 80s, showing that this existing chemical was a threat to human health and the environment. But the companies that had that data chose not to reveal it. They simply didn't tell the government agencies. They didn't tell the public. So the regulators didn't know to even regulate it. So by the time we found out about it and started providing that information out to the scientists and the regulators in the early 2000s, the chemical had already saturated the planet. This chemical had already been used in all of these products. And then to try to actually take action on an existing chemical like this is incredibly difficult in the US. To actually go back and regulate something like that that's already been out there is an incredibly long, tedious process. And we've been seeing that here. It's been 20 years and we're still waiting to set an actual drinking water standard at the federal level here in the US for this one chemical, PFOA, where we have the most comprehensive human health studies ever done, all of this data that's been brought out. The agencies have finally said, we will set a standard, but they're still working on it. So in the meantime, people are exposed, people are getting sick, and they had to go into courts in the legal system, to try to get the water cleaned up and to try to get all this done. So it's an incredibly complex system. And there are major gaps, and in the US, we just assume when you turn that tap water on, well, somebody must be making sure that's safe. That somebody's testing everything. No, you're only looking and testing for certain known regulated materials. And what we see with PFOA and with the PFAS story, there could be incredibly toxic, persistent, carcinogenic, bioaccumulative chemicals out there that just aren't regulated because the information wasn't provided. So I think a lot of folks have been referring to this story as a reason why we really need to stop and think about, do we need to maybe be rethinking the way we address chemicals and the way in which we regulate, so that we can make sure this type of thing doesn't happen, that we don't have an entire family of chemicals that escapes regulation for decades. And we only find out about it after it's too late.
Again, going back to the film, one of the really striking and real human elements of that is actually one of the long waits that you see towards the end of the film, where characters, or not characters, but real people within that story are being diagnosed with cancer. And, some of those people, of course, are phoning you up looking for answers because of that. And that must have been an incredibly difficult thing to deal with when you're trying to fight a battle and to make change that's taking so long. Those real human tragedies are happening along the way. That just simply can't have been something that was easy to deal with at all.
Yeah, that was a difficult time. In fact, I think they captured that fairly well in the film, and I talk about that a little more in the book, Exposure, as well. When we sat down to try to independently confirm what we'd already been seeing in the company's own internal studies, going back decades, that this was toxic, it had a cancer threat. And the company, though, was just refusing to accept that. We sat down to set up this process to try to confirm what the health effects were with these independent scientists. Nobody had ever done this before. We had no idea how long it would take. We had no idea how many people in the community would turn out and participate. We ended up getting 70,000 people in that community who came forward and provided blood samples and provided access to their medical information so that we could have a big enough sample size to actually confirm some of these health effects, particularly the health effects that tend to be rare. Things like cancers, where you need tens of thousands of people in your study size to be able to actually find effects. So that process ended up, as I mentioned before, stretching out over 7 years. It was an incredibly time-consuming process. And in the meantime, we're dealing with a real community, with real people who are still exposed and are still being diagnosed with these diseases every day. People were turning up with cancers, people were dying as we're waiting for this information. So it was very stressful, to know that we were responsible for getting this process through and for getting that data done and getting that information out. Because what we realized was it wasn't even just that community of 70,000 people. This was a chemical that was likely in drinking water all over the planet, that was in human blood all over the planet. And we needed to be able to get the science out so that people could start taking steps to protect themselves. Rest of the world had no idea that this chemical was out there or that they were being exposed. So it took a long time, took an incredible long time. And some people, unfortunately, including Mr. Tennant and his wife, died during this period of time while we were waiting for this information to come out. But I think they and their family would be very happy, with the end result, which was being able to independently confirm these links with disease, such that now the entire world has access to that science. And we're seeing the laws, the rules, and the regulations change because of that, because of one person like Mr. Tennant, or one family, the Tennant family, or his entire community being able to get together, stand up and speak out and say, this needs to change. Even when you're dealing with one of the biggest companies on the planet, you're dealing with the entire federal U.S. legal system, the way in which regulations are set, the way in which science is set, all of those things can be changed. And I think this story helps highlight, the power of even a single individual standing up and insisting we need to do something different, in the fact that it can be done.
And Mr. Tennant did that. He did stand up and he did, make that point. But he did that to a number of people. He did that to local lawyers. He did that to his local politicians, as you mentioned earlier. But they didn't really listen and take him up on it. It was you that did that. And you did obviously say that, at one point early on in that conversation, you almost did hang up the phone. What stopped you from hanging up the phone, and what drove you to champion Mr. Tennant?
Initially, I think it was just that family connection. The fact that this was somebody from what I kind of viewed as my hometown, and somebody that my grandmother was recommending, and that I should be able to help him. And then when I sat down and listened to him and visited that farm and spoke with that family and saw what was happening, I wanted to help. I mean, this was something I felt like I could do with the training that I had. And then the more information I saw, the more of these documents that I read, the more that I saw what the actual impact to these people was, the more convinced, I was that this was a massive public health threat. This was something that the public, the scientific community, the regulatory world, people needed to see this. And over the years, I just kept having in the back of my mind, if I could only find a better way to bring this story forward and bring this out, this can be addressed. And, I started off doing it through sort of the traditional legal system, filing briefs in court and arguing things in court. That has a limited impact within the legal world. Then sort of reaching out to the regulators, sending them letters, trying to help encourage them to look at this issue. And then over the years, that has expanded and we've had the incredible opportunity to do a documentary, to do a feature film, to do a book, all of these efforts to try to find new ways to tell that story and connect with people so that people understand the significance of what we're dealing with. Because again, the whole time in the back of my mind is this is a massive public health threat that's going completely unrecognized and unaddressed. And it's encouraging to see how much has changed just within the last couple of years, just since the movie rolled out. We've seen this discussion occurring worldwide. Just what we're doing today is an example of that. The fact that we're talking about this is incredible to me. Something that probably wouldn't have happened even several years ago, but something that I think is critically important. That we reach out and try to reach as many people as we can to let them know this actually happened. This is actually still happening, but we can fix it. There are ways to address this, and it can be done.
The work on this hasn't stopped. It's really only building up, as you say. I think so far, you've secured in excess of $1 billion for people that have been impacted by PFA contamination. President Biden, I think, has announced plans to try and do something about PFAS in water. Does that come close to even scratching the surface, or is that very much still the first steps?
I think we're getting there. I guess I'm cautiously optimistic. As you mentioned, something happened recently that really, I guess, highlighted how far the conversation has been elevated. We saw the President of the United States talk about the need to address forever chemicals in nationwide, something I thought I would never see happen. And in fact, allocated $10 billion under the federal infrastructure bill here in the U.S. It really highlights this is important. This is something we need to be talking about. But it also underscores a critically unappreciated aspect of this story that I'm focusing on right now, which is accountability, making sure that the people who actually cause this problem are responsible for addressing it. Not all of us, not the victims of this pollution. And here's what I mean. As over the last several years, what we've seen is this chemical, sure enough, and the family of chemicals has been turning up in drinking water all over the planet, all over the United States. There are communities now struggling with trying to pay the cost to get this stuff filtered out of their water, to deal with the medical issues of impacts to their citizens. Cities, states across the United States are now bringing claims. We're assisting cities and states, to try to make sure that the costs of cleaning this up aren't borne by the ratepayers, the citizens, the taxpayers, but that the companies who created these chemicals and then pump them out into these products, into the world, knowing for decades, if we do this, it will get into the environment and stay there, or it will get into people and stay there or build up and cause these problems, but did it anyway and didn't tell the rest of us. By the way, these chemicals are now in these products, and if you use them, you're going to be exposing the world. They did it anyway. Those are the companies that ought to be paying these costs. And so a lot of what I've been focusing on the last several years is working with impacted people all over that are trying to make sure that the costs of dealing with this and cleaning this up are borne by those parties, the people that caused the problem. And one of the other things I've been working on recently is as we've been learning that there are more and more of these PFAS, it's not just the C8s, it's not just PFOA and PFOS, but we have these C4s and C6s and C9s that are getting out into the water all over. What we're hearing from the manufacturers is what we heard them say about PFOA 20 years ago. You, the exposed people, you don't have any evidence sufficient to prove that they're causing harm. And it's your burden to prove that they are. Now, remember, we did that with PFOA. The community got together. We proved and confirmed that the chemical was, in fact, causing harm and was linked with these diseases. That led to it finally being phased out. But now what we're hearing is, but that was just for PFOA. You don't have similar data about these other PFAS, and it's your burden to do that. So I looked at that situation and thought that's just inherently wrong. And so I filed a new case here in the U.S. A couple of years ago where we're seeking to have independent panel of scientists do whatever additional science is necessary to confirm what these additional PFAS may be doing to us. And the critical thing is, if there are new studies that have to be done, new testing, and that the companies have to pay for that whatever those additional costs are to do those studies, not the taxpayers, not the rest of us. And just recently, a court approved that case to go forward on behalf of millions of people here in the U.S. who have these chemicals in their blood. And we'll see, where that goes. But as a lawyer, I'll be the first to tell you, people shouldn't be having to keep going into the courts to get clean water, to get protections for their health, to get compensated for the damage that these chemicals are causing. When again, they've been manufactured by a very small group of companies. We know who those companies are. They should be responsible for this. Yet we have, we're still watching as the fight goes on over, do we adopt laws to actually make those folks responsible and hold them responsible? And we're seeing the debate go on back and forth about that. So it's an ever-changing, evolving story here.
And as that story does evolve and as those debates do take place, those chemicals continue to accumulate in us as humans right across the world. We go back to constantly about these chemicals being released into the water. But that water, I guess, is then not just being drank by us, but it's been drank by our livestock and coming through the food chain that way as well.
Yeah, one of the things that's, unfortunately, it's been known for decades, but it's only just now sort of being picked up by the scientific community and by the press, is the fact that, when these chemicals are used in all these different products, a lot of that stuff ends up in our wastewater, okay, from homes or from factories. And that wastewater is then ends up in wastewater treatment plants across the world. And historically, at least in the United States, a lot of times those wastewater plants create like a sludge where the stuff is settled down to the bottom, and they create this, what they call biosolids or biosludge. And historically, a lot of that was given away to farmers as fertilizer and spread across agricultural fields all over the United States. And unfortunately, what we're now coming to realize is some of that biosolids actually was concentrated PFAS. There are very high PFAS in some of those biosolids that were given to farmers. And unfortunately, we're now starting to realize the impact of that some of that PFAS, once it's spread on the fields, can seep down into the ground. It can be taken up by certain crops. It's then consumed by the animals, like cows that are grazing on those crops, taken up by the food crops. There was a fairly well publicized incident here in the U.S. with a farm in Maine where dairy cows were contaminated and had to be destroyed. A similar situation out in New Mexico where thousands of cows had to be euthanized after they were contaminated from grazing on fields with contamination. So it's an expanding problem, because the more we realize how widespread these chemicals have been, the more we realize it's not just in our consumer products, but it's in our food. It's in the trees. It's in the soils, the vegetation that's taken up into our food system. And unfortunately, it's virtually contaminating biota all over the planet at this point. And it's even, some of these chemicals have even been found in polar bears, in Arctic ice caps, because they have this ability to get up into the clouds, for example, where PFOAs, some of them still might be manufactured in other countries overseas. This stuff gets emitted into the air. It can somehow adhere to the water droplets in clouds and then come down in the rain, which is how we end up with this stuff being transmitted globally. So it's created an incredible wealth of opportunity for scientists trying to figure out, how does this stuff get everywhere? How is it getting into all of these different animal species, all of this different vegetation, water and soil all over the place? And unfortunately, it's because the stuff moves rapidly, but it also then stays where it's put.
The classic example that gets used in schools when we talk about bioaccumulation and biomagnification is DDT, which was obviously another modern synthetic, was used as an insecticide in the 1940s, again created around about the time of that Second World War. It was used for tackling insect-borne diseases successfully. It was used by the military, it was used by farmers in agriculture, and was very effective at controlling insects when it came to crops. Has any of the work around DDT and any of that, has that influenced what's happening now with some of the PFA?
Yeah, it's disturbing when you look at the parallels here. When the DDT situation first got revealed, you had the famous book Silent Spring by Rachel Carlson back in the early 60s. It was really highlighting the fact of look at the impact of these man-made chemicals and what's happening to the entire environment, and really kind of launched the environmental movement here in the U.S. and led to the formation of the U.S. EPA. And you go back and look at that story, and you see remarkable parallels with what's going on with PFAS. In the situation here, you just had a lot more, frankly, of the information covered up for a lot longer period of time. And, we only just now started realizing, how bad this stuff was and how long it had been used. But we're dealing with some of the same issues that were highlighted back then, is how do we address the proliferation of these materials? How do we make sure that adequate safety and testing and studies are done, and that the burdens are placed on the right folks, that the exposed people aren't the ones who are told, let's see how many of you get sick. Let's see how many people develop cancer. Let's wait 20 or 30 years and see what the cancer rates are before we take action. And I see there's a lot of discussion now about trying to shift the discussion to more of a precautionary approach. We see that more often in Europe than we do in the United States, where you don't wait until the damage is done, until the people have died of cancer or you have thousands of people that are sick. When you start to see the warning signs, or when you see similarities in the chemical structure between some of these PFAS, for example, and PFOA that we already know cause these problems, that you take action now to prevent the harm. You don't wait for it to occur. So that's a big debate that's now going on, at least in the United States, about whether we should be taking actions to protect and prevent harm before the harm occurs. Because in our legal system here in the U.S., it's much more focused on you can't pursue these claims. You can't even move through the court system unless you can prove that these things actually cause these harms, which oftentimes is too late.
A lot of young people listening to this and who have maybe seen the film, what would you say to them if they're listening to this and maybe feeling a little bit worried about it all?
Yeah, it can be a little overwhelming, but I think when you step back and take a look at this, I think it's a positive story. It's an optimistic story because it shows that we can change these things. We can make a difference. It took a long time to figure out what was happening here with PFAS and to be able to get what we're now seeing, which is almost uniform scientific consensus about the harms that are caused and the need to do something about it. And the power of people being able to actually change that going forward. And as we talked about, we're already seeing that through laws and regulations that are being discussed and debated now to try to fix these things going forward, but also the power of the individual and the consumer. We've talked about the power of individuals actually prompting these changes and going forward with cases like what Mr. Tennant did, or prompting government agencies to act. But on another level, we're seeing consumers and individuals who are saying, hey, we want the option to make a choice here. We want to know, were these chemicals used in these products? And they're reaching out to big companies and filing petitions and saying, hey, we don't want you to use these anymore. And it's working. There are, for example, big fast food retailers in the U.S. have made commitments now based on consumers demanding it, that they're going to phase these chemicals out of their packaging and their wrappers. clothing retailers, cosmetic companies, big companies are now responding to consumers who are saying, we want to know if you've been using these and we don't want you to use them anymore. And even though we're still waiting for the laws and the rules and the regulations to all catch up and change, that type of activity is creating change right now. The companies are pulling these chemicals out of their products. They're switching to safer alternatives. So I think that's really encouraging, and that's empowering for folks who want to be able to help make the change and to make, frankly, a change in their own individual choices. You can now jump online. There are groups out there that are making available lists of the different types of products where these chemicals have been used in the past, and naming the companies that have committed to moving away from them, so that you can make your own choice to stop being exposed, to at least to the extent you can now.
Throughout all of that, you'll have learned so much and had such a unique experience in some ways, and taken on so much pressure and weight on your own shoulders. If you had to pass on something to young people listening about what you've learned about yourself, about learning, and generally, I guess, about the world we live in, what would you say to them?
I think as I look back on this, my wife and I have talked about this before as well. You need to be willing to take a risk, to step outside of your comfort zone, and to recognize that just because things have been done a certain way doesn't mean that's the way you got to always do it. And be willing to change things, and to be willing to speak up and do something different. I had never thought in a million years that I would be involved in something, as we talked about at the beginning, that was involving all this science and chemistry, and or be involved in something that was something involving an unregulated chemical. But you need to be willing to take those risks. And it may seem like something way outside of what you should be doing, or something you're familiar with or comfortable with, but it's worth it. And that's where the real change gets made, is when you're willing to step outside that comfort zone and do something new.
And you don't need to be Hulk nor married to Catwoman to do that.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Rob, thank you so much for coming on and speaking to the Higher Biology podcast. Biology obviously wasn't your bag at school, but you're a huge inspiration to our young biologists in Scotland and anywhere else that's listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking with you.